I will do that on Dan's behalf, and I'm hopeful that he'll, if he is not otherwise disposed today, will hop in and at least give us some grief in the comments here. But so, Peter, for folks who are unfamiliar with your background, how did you get into this weird space we are in technology? How did you find yourself into this CTO role? And I got a lot of questions about that, but let's start where I always like to start, which is, how'd you get here?
Let me see if I can do a compressed version and jump over some things because I have what I might call a non-traditional career path.
No way.
So I did a master's degree in electronic communication and computer systems engineering. So we had some programming, a lot of physics, satellite communications, super geeky. Then I'm like, that's okay, but I'd like to be the next Tony Robbins. So I became a psychotherapist trained in Ericksonian hypnotherapy and neurolinguistic programming and started running motivational seminars.
As one does. It's
As
a
one
very
does.
natural progression.
Did that for a while, realized that unfortunately I was unable to run a business because I couldn't get enough people to come to my seminars. So I'm like, okay, I should learn about sales. So I became a sales rep, selling space in parliamentary diaries, cold calling, stand on a table. Charles Ashcroft here, diplomatic group. Wonder if you want to speak capital. We have an opportunity for a plumber in the parliamentary diary. And I immediately thought of Bill's Plumbing. I was wondering if this might be an opportunity that you would be willing to take advantage of. Do, like hundreds of dials a day, like just hardcore boiler room. Then I had some success there. So I'm like, okay, I've learned the phone. Now I've got to learn how to do it in person. So I became a photocopier salesperson in London in the early 90s, where I was getting chased out of buildings by security as I was like running in, like, I'm going to see Sentry Security. Yes, Bill over there. Yeah, he knows me. And then you'd go up to the top floor and then just ask all the office managers for their business cards till you got kicked out, dial them all and sell stuff. But it did allow you to learn the craft of sales, in between the breaking and entering, because it was an opportunity. There was no reason to buy one copier over another, Minolta, Kona,
Right.
whatever. They're all the same thing. So it was simply your ability. And funnily enough, it turns out that sales and psychotherapy are the same profession with different payment mechanisms.
That's a good point.
Because it's either like, well, can you imagine all of your staff, the copy is going to work faster, you're going to be done with it, they're going to be working more efficiently, your presentation is going to look better? Or can you imagine where you are able to leave the home and the agoraphobia doesn't like limit your life? Turns out many of the language patterns and approaches are very similar. Did that, built a sales training company to help other people to hire and manage salespeople, then became a full service ad agency. I wrote copy, got a buddy to do the design, moved that to the States. And then in 1997, so about 5 years after this journey out of college began, people started talking about this interweb stuff for real. And so we started building CD-ROM catalogs.
Ooh.
It's the CD-ROM catalogs, sales aids, like tools for like showing that I was in Houston, Texas at the time, like your industrial shaker would, cost less to run and improve the efficiency of oil field operations compared to someone else's based upon the number of barrels of mud and whatever it was. And then trade show booths and of course websites.
Sure. Yeah.
And then briefly after that, I was like, hey, so building these websites for people's fine, but like I'm too lazy to keep writing the code. How about if I get the computer to write it?
Right.
And then by 2000, I raised $1 million, built Squarespace 15 years too early. So
I hate when that happens.
Business Forge, $1 million websites for $1,000 a month. And it was basically a set of DSL, a set of domain-specific languages for describing and implementing commerce, newsletter, forums, content management, all the bits and pieces you would need to build a business online. Got sold to a company in New York, did help them with a roll-up. They then went out of business. And then I spent a number of years just focused on domain-specific languages, domain-specific modeling, and saying, how can we create this kind of combination of internal and external DSLs for effectively describing and building web applications? That's phase one. And then you did that for a while, finally got a visa. I got an O1 visa to allow me to
There
kind
you
of
go.
stay in the States when I was 40. Took a while. So that was in like 2010 or something. And then,
That seems about right. It usually takes a long time to get those kind of official paperwork
it,
pieces checked
well,
off.
that one in special, so I decided to quit college 3 months before graduating,
Oh,
which
that's
is,
an
I was
interesting strategy.
Well, the idea was with the cockiness that only a 21-year-old has. I'm like, look, I went to my academic advisor, and he said, I said, I'm leaving. Thanks so much. He said, wait, leaving? Like, what's up? You've only got 3 months. I'm like, well, we're here at university to learn stuff, right? Yeah. And you know I can pass exams because I did well every other year. Yeah. And we don't learn anything the last 3 months. We just do revision for exams. I said, well, I don't want to work for a company that's dumb enough they can't figure out whether I'm good without a piece of paper. So thank you so much for your service. Um, Perhaps the best part of that, I meet him in a nightclub about 4 months later, and he's like,
Oh God.
off of his face, and he's like, "Oh my God, I did it! Like you coming in there like that, I finally decided to, give up my career as a college professor and do my own startup.
Oh
So
my
I'm
God.
now responsible for probably putting his wife and child on the streets, depending upon whether or
Or
not it was, or maybe he's a
or he's a
billionaire. Who knows?
multimillionaire. Who knows, right? Yeah. So I think I would take the positive spin on that, right? Sort of the glass half full
Uh,
approach to that. But
that might be an appropriate way to
yeah.
go.
Yeah.
Um,
You know,
yeah.
I mean, that is one of those things I find so fascinating about our space is there is no one way to get there. If you're going to be a lawyer, a doctor, things of that nature, maybe more grown-up professions, I guess, than software. There is a prescribed path, and there may be some nuance in it, but software seems incredibly unique in that regard, in that I seemingly everyone I know has a vastly different way of getting from point A to point B. I mean, I never would have thought sort of psychoanalysis, motivational speaker as the entree into being a software entrepreneur, but here
Uh,
we are.
Arguably, you're simply doing something similar, like especially neurolinguistic programming. It's like a cognitive behavioral therapy approach and neuroscience hypnotherapy. You're kind of like trying to install programs in people. So
Yeah.
a lot of it was similar to start to talk about things like secondary gain. So somebody wants to give
Hmm.
up smoking, but you know what? Then they got no reason to like get up from their desk and go outside, and they don't get to meet with their friends because their friends are the smokers in the smokers
Yeah.
corner. So you're actually debugging the edge cases of that human's condition and
Right.
helping them to implement subroutines that get them the secondary gains without necessarily having to end up with lung cancer. So
Yes.
it's surprisingly similar from a certain perspective.
I feel like that would be really helpful when it comes to figuring out what our customers need the software to do. I heard, so these generative AIs have been getting a bit of attention of late, of course,
Well,
and
wait, generative what?
exactly, and I know there's a little bit of, oh, this will replace programmers, and somebody made this comment. I don't remember where I first heard this, but a couple months ago, someone said, you know what? As soon as a customer can tell me exactly what they want, then I'll worry about being replaced by AI. Until then, I think I'm good. So,
I feel like there's such a wide spectrum there, right? Because it's everything from you see people who are like, oh, it's kind of like moving from Vim to JetBrains, like to an IDE of some kind, right? You get your autocomplete, you get your 15-20% productivity boost. You can double click on the services and see where they are and see where the classes are and where it was defined. And
mhm.
then there are other people who are like, we don't need programmers anymore because we don't actually even need. I mean, it's interesting because there are two separate things. One is improving the efficiency of writing software, and then
Yep,
the other is potentially removing the need for classes of software whose primary job is to provide an interface over a set of information that could be engaged with conversationally.
sure.
Right? So some of the software just disappears. Like, no, I'm not going to create a data interface where you can like build your SQL queries. Just tell the prompt what you want out of the data, and it will tell you
Right.
what it is, and then you can use multi-shot to refine the processing till you get the output you want. Um, it's going to be interesting to see. I've just done a series of interviews. Everyone from like Albert Wenger, who's the a managing partner at Union Square Ventures, a
Mhm.
great kind of early stage VC firm in New York, right across to Matt Welsh, who founded Fixie.ai, Mike Buford, who was the CTO at Greenhouse and is now starting his own Gen AI thing. I've probably spoken to 20 generative AI founders. And the one thing I'd say is now I definitively have less of an opinion about what this is going to end up with as I did before. It's like
Interesting.
there's a huge cone of uncertainty. I mean, Albert Wenger, I think, had the most interesting perspective. He said there's a huge amount of ridiculous and unreasonable and unconscionable hype around this. And
Right.
it's going to be a bigger change than moving from agrarian to industrial society.
Right.
Both things
Right.
are true.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there is sort of that sci-fi notion, if you've ever read like the Culture series, for example, where that sounds like a pretty damn good world to live in, where these minds take care of all the basic things and we can just be uploaded into the cloud and we can go ahead and do free soloing if we want, because if we die, no problem, we'll just be reinstated. And oh, I hope my backup's current. And like, oh, I missed a couple of days. Oh, that's all right. I mean, that's some crazy stuff for sure. And I have no doubt that there's going to be some amazing change coming. But it's like that I think it's Gates quote, right, where we overestimate what's going to change in the next 2 years and underestimate, I can't remember if it was 10 or 20, but
I think.
yeah, I think it was something in that ballpark. And I completely agree that seems to be the norm, where it's like, oh, that's it, we're done with programmers, they're gone. Maybe just cool your jets a little bit on that. But by the same token, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, I think about, having a teenager, I think a lot about what's the world going to be like, when he has kids, if he has kids. And it's like a lot different than it is today, for sure. I mean, these little supercomputers that we all have in our pockets at all times, they didn't exist until he was born.
One of my great examples for that was I was speaking with Mike Buford, and one of the things he said, which is transformation. I think Tal Khan spoke about this at TED recently, which is basically he said he was using OpenAI. OpenAI is the best tutor he's ever had.
Sure.
So what he did was he would ask in a prompt like, okay, quiz me, ask me questions to determine how well I understand generative AI and large language models. Okay, now let me know which ones I got wrong. Now ask additional questions to determine why I got it wrong, and then give me the information and then ask more questions until I get it right. So effectively, the ability to create mastery-based learning through prompts on any arbitrary topic. You start wrapping an interface around that and imagine that every kid in the world, for close to free, other than the cost of running the models, is going to have access to a perfectly patient tutor.
Yeah.
And the fact that you get a 2 sigma difference, somebody taught in a classroom versus somebody taught with a personal tutor, is substantially more likely to be successful in that domain.
Sure.
I wonder what I certainly know my kid's going to be a lot smarter than me, if only because of the better educational opportunities.
Right. Yeah, that's fascinating. I read something too recently about this, generative AI as being the right way to interface with documentation. So rather than scroll through the documentation trying to find how do I do this or how does this work or what's the setting, just ask AI, how do I do this? And then it goes through and does that for you, obviously much, much faster.
I think was it Sam Schillis over at Microsoft he has like a CIO, he has a series, and I think he was talking about like the future of documents. I don't know if that was the one, but actually it might have been somebody else. I now realize I may just have misattributed. Apologies in advance. Downside with live. Also, it's funny because for somebody who actually runs a community of people, like I shouldn't be allowed to run like Monkey's Tea Party. Like I have absolutely no ability to remember names, humans, basic social norms. So apologies in advance. This is going to be a fun interview. But yeah, I think it's, to me, the biggest challenge with AI. It's interesting. At our last conferences, I run these summits for data platform and engineering leaders. And at the last summit, there was a very high correlation back in May between the people who thought that that Gen AI would be impactful, and the people who'd actually spent time playing with it personally. And one of the things that I think is going to make this a particular risk of disruption is that anybody who's got a real job can be kind of too busy to play with this stuff. And if you're too busy to be playing with this stuff, somebody who has the time is probably going to be able to disrupt you by leveraging it to more effectively do the stuff you're still doing manually.
Sure. Yeah, and I feel like that's where this is going to be beneficial, and not just to software programmers. I think there's going to be a lot of interesting implications and applications of this that we haven't thought of yet, haven't seen yet. But I look at it that way, as this is sort of like the developer. Like I very distinctly remember pairing with someone this would have been in the early aughts. We were writing Java and he was using VI.
Mm-hmm.
And I just couldn't get my head wrapped around that. I also paired with someone who was using Emacs. That one made slightly more sense. But we still had, really good IDEs at that time. And I just was shocked that these folks were using text editors like I did in college because I didn't have another choice. And it's that leap from just using a normal text editor to, oh, look, I get a red squiggly. Oh, I must have gotten that wrong. It's like working without autocorrect these days. I read some article that said, oh, the kids these days, they don't know how to spell. They don't know how to do math. And I kind of thought, well, they don't really need to.
That's what the computers do.
Right? I have lost track of how many times I'm like, I have no idea to spell this. Just, okay, squiggly. Correct. Yep. No, that wasn't it. Oh, God. Okay. It can't guess what I'm trying to say. Well, okay, let me try this. So there's probably a U in there somewhere. No, that wasn't it. And and that to me is a huge step forward because I remember having to memorize all this stuff. Not particularly useful, especially when the computer's better at it than you are. So that's where I think this is going to get really exciting is those tasks that we have had to do by hand or that have been very error prone and like, no, let the computer just take that toil away.
Absolutely. And it's important to realize because on the one hand, you don't spend that much time actually like typing letters on a keyboard as a programmer,
Right.
specifically into an IDE, right? I mean, because you're having meetings, doing design decisions, doing reviews of API. I think a lot of the speed up is it's basically Stack Overflow and steroids, right? Instead of having to put the Google search in, go to Stack Overflow, cut and paste the code, you get the code immediately. Don't get me wrong, it might have hallucinated a Go API when it's only actually available for Java, Python, and Ruby, but it gives you a starting point. And I think eventually also like a lot of the hallucinations and the other stuff, that's going to go away as you start to look at large language model prompts not as solutions, but think of them as a transistor. Think of them as like one of n steps. You run an arbitrary number of them in parallel against different models. You run a subset of them to look for the hallucinations in the output from the other models. And it just aggregates all that stuff and gives you something with a higher degree of certainty than a human would reasonably be able to deliver.
Yeah, that's actually a very good point. I think one of the misconceptions a lot of people have about software is that it's mostly typing. And if you were a faster typist, you'd be better. I mean, I genuinely think this is why so many of our customers struggle to understand why it's hard to change or hard. They'll make these radical changes in scope and think that it'll have no effect on time or cost. And you'd never see that in the real world. You'd never see someone say, well, listen, I said I wanted a single family dwelling, with a couple thousand square feet and 4 bedrooms. But now that I think about it, I'd really rather that be a 6-story apartment building.
Right.
But I don't want that to change anything.
Right. Like, I know you're halfway built, but if you could just demo it and like put the
totally start over, but I don't want it to change the end date. I don't want to change my budget. That's absurd in the real world. And then in our space, they're like, well, it's just typing. I type all the time. I change emails. I change Word documents. It's fine. So just type. It's like, yeah, that's not the hard part.
The challenge there too. So I spent so much. I mean, even when I was on the No Fluff Just Stuff tour, that I would talk about requirements because I spent a long time.
Yeah.
Turns out that the hard part, I figured out the domain specific modeling stuff. I got to the point where I could build, a $50,000-$100,000 web application in a day and a half because I had a set of external. Back in the day, XML, domain-specific languages, I could use them to describe things. I could override with little snippets of custom code, anything where I needed a method that was with expressiveness that was outside of the capabilities of the DSLs I'd built. I had it all down. And I was like, man, I'm going to be able to take, everyone else charges $50,000. I'm going to be able to have an internal cost of, maybe they have an internal cost of 25,000, so there's profits. I'm going to be able to get that down to 15,000, then 10,000, then 5,000, then 500. I'm going to be able to sell these things for 15 grand, so they're going to fly off the shelf.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it doesn't work because the hard part isn't even implementing the requirements. It's actually gathering and agreeing on the requirements. And that was a minimum tax that I was never able to reduce.
Yep, 100%.
Well, the other thing, though, it's also the sophistication of the mental model, which is, okay, I want to move. I remember when I'd implemented MongoDB as the back end for, imagine if there was a website which you used to have a shared conversation with a group of friends across a heterogeneous set of social sites. So the problem is you want to start it on LinkedIn, but then you want to be able to bring in people from Facebook. And so we
Yeah.
had I kind of remember Skinio. It was like, what's the Skinio? Was the so
Okay.
Skinio.com, like back in the day, it's not there
Yeah. Yeah.
anymore. And it would bring you basically to a screen where everyone could chat and share their information. You could quickly access that from all the networks. So it was a very lightweight way to have thoughtful, meaningful conversations.
Yeah.
And I implemented it using Mongo, which was super exciting and super fun. This is back in 2010 or whatever it was. So it wasn't new, but it was early-ish.
Right.
And
Still
then I
had that new
realized,
software smell.
right? Doesn't every developer? And then I had this experience where I'm like, oh, you know what I need to do is I need to have the CEOs for a very reasonable tweak, which is we want to know how credible a person is. So let's use a proxy for that, how much they've talked, which
Sure.
we'll get out of the fact that that's not a great proxy, but let's just pretend that it is. Unfortunately, though, the way I'd persisted everything, I'm like, wow, that's going to 10x our processing costs because I actually have the information in separate documents. So I would now need
Right.
to write a script to go to
Right.
iterate over those to determine the count, to persist that in a counter somewhere to actually know for each user how many. So suddenly there's this huge architectural change. But honestly, what's the difference between show me the count and then if I'd say built it in Postgres with a relational database, it might have just been a very lightweight,
Right. Right.
lightweight change. So it's unreasonable to ask business stakeholders to understand the difference between document and relational data stores. So I don't know how we ease the problem of allowing them to figure out the difference between. I'd like the faucets to be a different color versus how
Right.
about 6 stories instead of 2?
Right. Right. Yeah. No, that's a great point. And by the way, Dan Vega just popped into the comments. Hello, Dan. Thank you for joining us. So I mean,
Hello,
I don't know about
Dan.
two
Oh my
smart people
God.
talking about smart people things. I guess we'll have to leave that to the end to see if we're successful with that. But we'll do our best. We'll try to facade that as best we can. But I mean that's such a hard thing about our space is trying to, and we can't predict the future, but trying to understand what are the likely dimensions of change and how can we accommodate that, and recognizing earlier in the process that, oh yeah, we're going to need to be able to do this, and that's going to be really hard if we use this approach, versus, well, this is the requirement in front of me today, and I'll just implement that requirement, and if a future requirement crops up, we'll deal with it when we can. I mean, it's hard to do that. It's hard to get that balance right. At least it has been in my experience.
It's super hard, right? Because the hard thing is it's not just higher levels of abstraction and more flexibility. Like I created a wonderful code generation application, Dan Vega, back when we were both, sorry to out you, Dan, when we were both programming in Code Fusion back in the day.
Wait, now for the record, we talked about this in the pre-show. You were young, you needed the money, said it would never end up on the internet. So we
Exactly.
all did things when we were young that we're not proud of, but we learned from the experience.
You know what? It's tough. There are 2 ways you can describe Code Fusion as a programming language. One is as PHP, but you have to pay by the server. Um, which is probably not the most appealing way of positioning it. But then the other was the first dynamically typed language on the JVM. Long before GimLaForge and Groovy, it was a dynamically typed language running on the JVM. So it was actually, I mean, its strength was its weakness. The strength of, I think, all of those tools was they allowed anyone to write software, and unfortunately, they did. And then we're now complaining about the software they wrote. So absolutely, Dan. No, and in fact, it's still a very active community. The CTO, the guy who used to be the CTO of Anaconda, like the Python system, is now CTO of a fast scaling unicorn that is building everything using Code Fusion. And he's pulled together this amazing team of people I know from back in the day.
Wow. Well, I think it was Glenn Vandenberg that I at least I've attributed this to him, but bad developers will move heaven and earth to do the wrong thing. And we so often ascribe the problem to the tool as opposed to, well, no, the people who are using it didn't know what they're doing. Like you can give me a nail gun and a circular saw and it isn't going to be pretty, the outcome. I mean, there's a pretty good chance I'm going to have to go to the emergency room and let's just hope they can reattach whatever I cut off, right? But that's not to say those tools are bad. It's because I don't know how to use them, not effectively, and so I think that's sometimes where we get lost in this, is we immediately assume that, well, this clearly is a bad tool, as opposed to, well, no, it was just used in a bad way. And we've all seen bad code written in every language. That's not specific to one thing as much as we may pretend it is. But.
Absolutely. And I think it's finding that right level of abstraction, right? Because I wrote this system which was insanely complicated. And then I realized when I tried to hire other developers, I'm like, oh, literally no other person is going to. It had so much monkey patch. It was a dynamically typed language, so it had so much magic going on under the hood that it was just hard to figure out where the code would be. Like I was using and I had like a whole bunch. I wrote a dependency injection framework. And we had aspect-oriented programming, so you could add aspects into calls from between objects. And what it basically meant is you kind of like needed a magic 8-ball to figure out where the code was when you were running a given operation. So it was not pretty.
But, in fairness, I feel like we're kind of in that situation with a lot of the applications we write today, because they've grown so large, because they are so dynamic in nature. You think about a lot of these distributed systems we write, you're just tossing events out into the ether, and somebody's registered interest and somebody's deregistered interest. And so what happens when a new customer signs up? Stuff. I don't know. I mean, it depends. But, I remember talking to Matt McCullough about that, and he made this point to me. He'd been at GitHub a long time. And he said, no one knows the entire code base. You just can't. It's too large. Even engineers who were here from day one, you can't load that all into your brain. And I think that's one of the other interesting aspects of software. As it gets larger, we have to come up with these different ways of sharding it, if you will. And I think that meshes a little bit with the AI thing we talked about earlier, is what happens when these systems really can't be reasoned about. It's like, I don't know, the AI did it. We're not sure why.
Well, I mean, the obvious, the obvious terminal point to that is where, it's the old thing about the factories that run with a man and a dog, and the man's, it's basically fully automated. The man's job is to take care of the dog, right? Like that's it. There's no other good use for us. And it makes perfect sense that AIs would be plausibly capable of reasoning about more complicated systems than we could. And therefore, there's going to be a level of complexity driven whereby, how do you build the next generation of AI models? Like we don't. The last generation of AI models builds them because we have no idea what they're doing. And it's hard for me to see a future where that would not be an element of where we're going, which does not necessarily remove the programming role. I think it will change the level of abstraction. And just to like, the thing I always like to put on that is, I still remember back in the day where people were like, look, compilers are fine and all, but I'm gonna have a look at the assembly generated. What is this, 6502? This is C800, whatever it is. I'm gonna look at the assembler command. Because like a compiler might be good, but it's never going to be as good as me.
I can do
optimizing. Better. I can do better. I can optimize like the register calls, and maybe I can like leave this number in a register and do 2 operations on it to reduce the load and unload time. It's been a while since I heard a professional software developer say, the Java compiler's okay, but I always go in and tweak the machine code a little bit just to make sure it's running well on the processor. So we have had these experiences of transforming the level of abstraction, and at least to this point, like stocks, past performance is no guarantee of future performance, but so far we still needed people to engage with the corralling of the human requirements to figure out what the system should do.
Yeah, that's a great point. I remember that same experience with SQL. I had a coworker who was very, very good at SQL. Now, I was not. I did just enough SQL, they wouldn't let me do that anymore, right? That's at least part of how I became a user interface person. But he was excellent at it. And as we started switching into like Hibernate and things of that nature, he's like, at first I was really skeptical of Hibernate, and it would do these weird things. And I'm like, this isn't right. And then eventually I finally just gave up and realized that it's got its reasons. It's better at this than I am, and that it's that same kind of shift. And so I'm sure we'll go through that again, where well, I don't know why the AI is telling me to do this, so I'm just going to go in by myself. And it's like, ooh, yeah, I'm not so sure about that. So, oh, hey, Fuel Snable's joining us. Good evening, Fuel. Thank you for popping in, my friend.
How do
Um,
you?
so, I mean, it's may you live in interesting times, I guess, is the moral of that story.
Absolutely. And I think it's also its driving patterns we're seeing. So, I mean, one thing is the evolution of, I work these days with companies that have like 100 plus engineers on the team. Because we used
Mm-hmm.
to do these CTO summits and it was awesome. We'd have CTOs from like 5-person companies and CTOs from 5,000-person companies. But turns out if you're running a team of 800 or you're running a team of 6, you might be CTO in both cases. The only thing you've got to talk about is the weather. You got the same job title, but you don't actually do
Right.
anything
Right.
overlapping. Um, and so we decided to focus, more on the mid and larger sized enterprises. But all of those guys are now like, how can we build platform teams? And
Mm,
it's interesting because the level of sophistication varies, right? I mean, I've seen companies where platform is the name for the 3 system admins who are desperately trying to figure out Chef or Puppet, but still like, FTP into production once in a while. And then there are the other companies that what is a platform team, I think
yeah.
is a great meta question. I think it started in most companies as a new term for operations
Yeah.
because we're all agile and we didn't want to talk about operations anymore.
Right.
So
Right. Because
typically the
DevOps, SRE. Yeah. Yeah.
right, but the baseline is you need somebody who makes sure that you have servers and they have
Mm-hmm.
operating systems and they're
Mm-hmm.
up to date and they
And they're
have all
patched
of the
and yep. Yep.
dependencies and patches and access to the various IPs they need and not access to ones they don't and ports and all that stuff needs to be taken care of.
Yeah.
But then I think what's interesting is now we're moving towards a world where the levels of abstraction are raising. They can be responsible for onboarding. They can be responsible for tooling. They can be responsible for potentially building shared APIs.
Fuel is the platform team.
And
Can
it's like,
relate.
right? And it's like, and again, it depends upon the scale of the company. It's like, it used
Right.
to be, I mean, we used Heroku like pre
Mm-hmm.
Salesforce and
Mm-hmm.
it was easy because it was just a thing and I didn't have to go hire 3 DevOps
Right.
people so that there was always one available when, one was drunk and one was sick or whatever it was.
Right.
So, I think platform teams are trying to raise the level of abstraction, and I think dev tooling companies and data tooling companies are building some really interesting tools now to help us to better reason about complicated multi-node microservices. Because the problem with microservices, the great news is every service is easy, and now you need some kind of like you go back to WSDL and stuff like that. You need a service
Mm.
description language to be like, well, we have
Too soon.
8,723 services, and
Right.
16 of them do authentication. Which one should we use? And
Yeah.
I'm talking internal services. This isn't
Yeah.
including
Yeah.
Auth0 and Fusion or
Mm-hmm.
the, like all
Mm-hmm.
the third-party tools.
Well, this is the one I always use. This is the one I wrote. And then I didn't like any of those, so then I wrote my own because I could clearly do it better than those idiots that wrote these other ones.
And
Yeah.
8,274, whatever it is, the
Exactly.
count ticks up.
Exactly. No, it's interesting to me how often we do that, where we and I've never quite figured out exactly why we as developers love to reinvent the wheel, but you keep seeing these patterns repeat themselves, and that seems to be one of them. Where, well, obviously I can do it better. Oh, I can create one of my own of these, and yes. So Fuel says, every developer knows that you can only trust your own code. I can't trust that stuff that was written by the person on other person on my team, and then yes, and then there's
Yeah.
imposter syndrome, of course. Yes, that plays into this in a big way. But I understand the desire for that, and then by the same token, I think, why is everybody building their own platform team? I mean, this feels like something that we would have argued about maybe 20, 25 years ago. Well, clearly we need our own compiler, and we need our own IDE, or I mean, things of that nature. Where you're like, why would you do that? There's a perfectly good one right here. So I mean, I wonder if it's a similar kind of thing. Like, do we really all need our own platform, or can we use, as Fuel says, the cloud as our platform?
Well, I mean, there's no question that there are use cases for racking and stacking servers, but for the vast
Yep.
majority of us, it does make sense that the cloud is our platform team, but it's not because you still have to tell the cloud what to do, right? Somebody
True.
needs to manage the Terraform code. Somebody needs to figure out what you're using for feature flagging. Somebody needs to make sure that you've got reliability or resilience engineering. You can kind of chaos monkey the thing and see how that works. There's a whole set of things you need to do to make your system work.
And
And
run in a cost-effective manner. There's another
right.
one, right? So, I mean, I had that exact experience. I wrote this application to scratch an itch to help my family with some stuff. And I'm like, okay, cool. I feel like I'm in a good place. I'm going to go ahead and put this into the cloud. And so I picked a cloud provider. Doesn't matter which one, because I thought this will be the easiest place to do it. And so I got it up and running. And one of the very, very first things I did was go in and put an alert in on this is my ceiling for how much I'm willing to spend. And within about 3 days, I got the ding, you are going to exceed your limit. And I'm like, how is this possible? When I clicked this box, it said the first 1,000 hours are free. And I thought, I barely hit it more than 10 times. There's no way I've even used 5 hours of compute. And then so I started digging, and it's like, oh, well, I'm paying like $7 for this and $4 for that. I'm like, why? I never clicked those boxes. Now, I'm absolutely of the opinion that someone who is more competent at this than I am with that particular provider could have gone in and gone click, 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 and it would have been $3.
Right.
But I couldn't. And so I'm like, stop, 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 delete, 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 different cloud provider.
Yeah. It's hard, right? I mean, with great power comes great responsibility. Cost effect.
Yes.
You know,
Yes.
fuel snell. I'd have said that last year. This year, turns out we're all reporting to the CFO. Yeah, it's so I love what the Paul, and I'm so sorry, I can't believe I've had her as a guest twice. I'm in so much trouble here. I love what the Darklang team did. Yeah, logging, seriously. I think that's fascinating. And there, one of the possibilities is to move to a fundamentally different level of abstraction. I
Yeah.
think that's going to happen at some arbitrary time in the future. So that you're not thinking about, oh, wait, I'm writing code, then I'm deploying it, then there's Terraform and there's Kubernetes and there's all these like layers and there's all these other tools. It's just like, oh, I'm engaging with a live running server, and then there are different ones, and all the rest is abstracted.
Mm-hmm.
Generally, the challenge with that is that you have to make optimizations that may or not be globally appropriate. And it's the same
Right.
reason why you have platform teams, is because when you're paying whatever it costs to have 200 full-time engineers on staff, paying 8 of them to make sure that the other, 192 are more efficient actually makes a lot of sense.
Right.
And yeah, as for the logging thing, there's a reason a lot of people have been relooking at the open source logging tools, right? There are some
Right.
phenomenal logging tools out there that get a little spendy, and at some point, I think we need to be rational economic, especially with
Yeah.
venture downturn and changes in the economy, and at some point in time, it's like, yeah, it seems expensive until you put 15 engineers onto building and managing a replacement, and then suddenly it's
Yeah.
not so pricey for
Yeah.
most
No.
people.
That's a fantastic point. I remember a similar conversation at an organization where they said, "Oh no, we won't buy you IntelliJ. That's crazy talk. Why would we spend $250 on this? We have a team of like 8 that manages our Eclipse tooling." And I'm like, those 8 people are expensive, right? Like a lot more than just buying IntelliJ licenses or similar kind of tools. And it's like, oh no, we're not going to do that, like, because this is free. I don't think that word
Yeah,
means what you think it means.
exactly. And sorry, I just got to put a point back in. I realized I dropped it because Darklang, it was Paul Bigger was the CTO, and then Alan Cheeser was the co-founder.
There we go. There we go.
Just amazing, both amazing professionals.
So let's see. Fuel says they dropped the CloudWatch cost by $5,000.
Yeah.
Yeah, nobody ever looked at it. And then, oh, Sean's hanging out with us. Hi, Sean. Thank you for joining us. I think I owe you a response somewhere too, Sean. I do apologize. I've actually been on vacation a little bit, which is kind of nice. We've been playing a lot of golf, which I really appreciate this time of year. Dan asked a little earlier, what are some of your favorite tools that you're playing around with these days?
So there are a number of different answers to the question. I mean, in the dev tooling space, I love like some of the kind of chaos monkey like
Yeah.
tools, like Gremlin and tools like that. I think it's kind of a little old school now, but like feature flagging, playing
Hmm.
with that. I think those are great. The truth is, though, for us as a company, we are so small, we've actually moved to no code. We're using
Oh,
bubble.io for
okay.
the web application, Attio, which is a new CRM, like almost like an API first, feels like Notion or Airtable kind of CRM, so you can build your own custom flows. And the tools I'm building are actually really not super interesting as a developer. It's like Lemlist for sending email drips, Apollo for code outreach, and
Sure.
Calendly for booking meetings so that I can keep my
Hmm.
hair pointy and not actually have blocks of, deep thinking time.
Right, right.
So that's a lot of the tooling. And funnily enough, like I've been playing with AI and I still haven't figured out with the, open AI and stuff like that, the right use cases for me.
Mm. Hmm.
I think at least a little bit because I'm a little too busy.
Yeah.
The tools that I'm fascinated by, though, is one of our communities is like a data platform leadership community. So it's like, how do you build data products and data platforms? So I'm just kind of on this whole journey learning everything from like Snowflake to Monte Carlo. Patch is a fascinating company that's trying to provide data packages in the same way as you would like package pieces of software, so that you can you can either package the interface so that that there will be certain calls and interface in a much lighter weight way than, oh, we got to ship a version 3 of our API, let's go do that. Imagine if you're updating your API every 6 weeks, not every two
Hmm.
years. uh,
Sure.
or even at a data level, like, okay, we'll actually guarantee you have the same data, so you get deterministic output. So for instance, for testing or for cases where you need to know that it is going to say certain things when you run certain queries. So and then vector databases like the pine cones and things like that. So I'm just really fascinated by that whole space, and surprised how little linear algebra you need to be able to play with it.
Sure. Sure. So, Sean, vacation, I think, is when you just ignore Slack, email, and calendar invites. I think that's probably the easiest way to describe that.
There's one other component to it, which is it is where you deliberately create a backlog you may never actually be able to get out from
Correct.
under by
Correct.
ignoring all of your responsibilities for a period of
Yep.
time.
Yep.
I still recommend
And
them.
absolutely. And Phil says you just work 8 hours a day. Yeah. Yeah. I guess that comes up occasionally as well. So, yeah. So, Fuel, I hope you're getting like a percentage of whatever you're saving by dropping these things. Because I actually worked in an organization for a long time where they had a standing, I mean, policy or kind of a thing where if you suggested something and it saved the company money, you would then get like 10% of the savings. And but that's brilliant, right? I mean, that's a good deal because even if you're paying somebody some money, you're getting some big savings in return. They got rid of that after someone suggested they switch the printers to all duplex. And that saved
Oh.
millions in paper. And all of a sudden they're like, we're writing a check to an employee for how much money? And it's like, and you're saving how much money? So come on now. That's seems like a reasonable thing to do. So yeah, just remove it and see who screams. That's always the fair way to go with that. So there you go.
Working for X, right? All you do is just fire all the engineers and see if anything doesn't break.
Right, right. What could possibly go wrong, right?
Well, the one other thing economically, I mean, it's bizarre, but when you think about it as a business owner, and I don't particularly like to think this way, the job of a business owner is to pay enough money to your employees that they're motivated, excited, and want to stay with you, and not so much that they don't need a job anymore. Right?
It's a fine line to thread.
I mean, usually not, but if they save you $60 million a year in printer savings, don't you want their other good ideas?
Right, right. That seems like the kind of employee you'd want to keep around, but that's just me. I don't understand why they decided, but that was what killed that particular program, and I thought that was incredibly short-sighted. So yeah, so code with Sean, I think it's always smart to have a day baked in to recover from vacation and do things like laundry or whatever else you didn't get done when you were supposed to, be doing other things. But such is life.
There are two bacons there. One is for vacation. The last day should be at home. But the other one is, and I
Right.
wish I'd learned this when I used to do 150 presentations a year, is you should always stay in the city for the weekend. If you can,
Mm,
if your family
yeah.
circumstances allow,
Yeah.
because if you don't, it's miserable. It's like, where were you this year? I don't know, a lot of Holiday Inns. and quite
Hmm.
a few
Hmm.
airports.
Yeah.
Versus
Well,
like I was in Prague, I was in Vienna, I was in Melbourne. The one guy, by the way, who does an amazing job of that is if you ever get to present in Australia, the YOW conferences.
yeah.
It's just amazing because you get it's just a wonderful experience, and there's just enough time between them to actually enjoy Australia.
Right. Right. No, that's a great point. In our jobs, we have had the luxury, the privilege of getting to go to a lot of cool places. But I think a lot of folks don't understand that this isn't like vacation travel where you're bringing some books and you're going to go to the beach and you're going to go to some museums and you're going to eat, I mean, we might get a chance to eat a decent meal here and there, but a lot of times it's, I don't know. I took an Uber to the hotel and then I went to the client site and then I took an Uber back to the hotel and then I got on an airplane. There's just, you're not there long enough in many cases. Well, and then either you've got to go on to the next place where it's like, I miss my family. I
Right.
don't
Well,
get a
that's
chance to hang out with
basically
them.
that's when I pulled it back was once I had a
Hmm.
kid. But it's like the
Yeah, I
two
know.
things. I mean, one I remember there was one trip where I landed in Copenhagen,
Hmm.
got the afternoon to recover, do some work, spent a full day teaching GitHub kind of class during the day. That evening, flew with one of their engineering leaders to Barcelona. Next day, taught a full day class there, and then I was back in Newark by 2 p.m. the next day.
Hmm. Hmm.
I did get bizarrely, one nice dinner in Spain with a
Hmm.
buddy from Colorado, but we were both just presenting at different things in Spain
Right.
on the same day.
Right. It is almost always the case that it's easier for me to get together with my friends when we are not in our home cities. If we're actually in our home cities, it's almost impossible
Stuff's
to get
going
together.
on.
There's too many things going on. And, I would say you really haven't been on a business travel binge unless you are checking in for the return flight while
But
you're on the outbound flight, or you do the embedded conference where
yep.
you do a conference in between a conference, and that's always fun.
What,
So yeah, I agree with fuel.
what the furthest I think I knew I had a travel problem. It's like some people drink, some people have a drinking problem. Like some people travel, I had a travel problem.
Travel
When
problem.
I
Yeah.
was looking seriously at the possibility of like I could have spent a morning in Australia because
Mm,
theoretically the flight from New York via San Francisco or LA got you into Sydney about 7:30 in the morning, and I figured if I could get a 10 o'clock slot, I think it was about a 12 or like a 9:30 slot. There was a 12:30 flight back, and it was only 45 minutes to and from the conference venue. I didn't do
oh,
it, but I was like this
that's
close to booking that,
brutal.
and it's a
That's
15-hour
funny.
flight each way.
Be- because I remember you and I talking once about the flight to Australia, and you just said, it's no big deal. You have 8 hours to work, 8 hours to sleep, and you're there. And you watch a movie in between. It's all good.
It's actually lovely, and especially if somebody will pay for business travel, it's a no-brainer. When you're
Yeah.
doing it in economy or economy plus, it's just a little harder to get the 8 hours of sleep.
Just a titch, or even to be able to move when you land. It's always a pleasure. And then, of course, yeah, you're absolutely right, Sean. You get the joy of weather or equipment or whatever, and you bake it in, and then all of a sudden, next thing you know, you're getting in 5 hours later the next day, or yeah, it's nowhere near as glamorous as some people make it out to be, but. And fuel, I hope that means you and will cross paths somewhere in
Ooh.
October. That would be interesting. I'm not exactly sure what my October holds yet, but fingers crossed. Now you keep kind of alluding to this, but tell me more about Geeks Who Lead, because I think that's such an interesting twist on this. We get so focused in our space on hard skills and being an engineer, and then we complain about there's no good engineering managers or very few. It's like, okay, well, how does one become a better engineering leader? I think it's such an interesting space that you inhabit there that some geeks tend to ignore, thinking like, oh no, that's management. I don't deal with management.
It's a really fun space. So what happened was I ran engineering at General Assembly. Managed to get fired in 6 months. I'm like, wow, I'm a really shitty CTO. Maybe I should get somebody to teach me how to do it right. I was a member of the New York CTO Club at the time, but unfortunately, there was the Elliot Horowitz was a founding CTO of MongoDB, and Lon Binder back then was CTO of Warby Parker. And some of these people were like very, very willing to share their wisdoms, and other ones were like like, we'd love to help you, but we got to double our team size in the next 9 months. We're a little busy right
Right.
now. Come back post exit, you know? And
Sure.
so I'm like, okay, fine. If I put 100 CTOs in the room, then would you tell me your stories? They all said yes. 3 weeks later, we're in the back of an Indian restaurant in Midtown, people paying $600 to scribble their own names on sticky labels, single day, single track. And there were about 100 engineering leaders and about 65 seats because the venue had not been honest about the space available. But it was
Shocking.
this great experience. So since then, I've run 36 of these CTO summits, of these engineering leadership summits. And it's just a great way for me. Here's the thing. I raised venture a couple times, managed to flame out both times. So I'm like,
Mhm.
okay, I'm getting too old and lazy to do this whole venture back lottery thing. How can
Right.
I, what should I do for the rest of my career? Because I still need to make money and I'd still like to have an
Right.
impact. And I said, how about if software is eating the world, then one of the highest leverage positions is if you can impact directors, VPs, and CTOs and get them to build better software and to create a better working environment for their teams, you have
Hmm.
huge impact and you get to hang out with all the cool kids building venture backed companies without
Right.
actually having to put in the 100-hour weeks. And so basically, I run this podunk little lifestyle business that connects some of the most interesting engineering leaders I've found around the world. And it's an opportunity, whether they're passionate about building data platforms, building software engineering platform teams, or just pure management, reorgs, and hiring, and all of those things. It's a place where they can connect with and learn from each other online and then in person in New York and San Francisco twice a year.
Sure.
And then we're creating a bunch of special SIGs now, special interest groups around you, like burnout, generative
Yeah.
AI, building an effective data platform team. What does data engineering really want to look like? And we're trying to aggregate that wisdom so that we can all get together and actually get, rather than just like a Zoom call where you listen to somebody, we can get together and actually learn and share our experiences as professionals.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't think we do enough of that. I think about a lot of other industries have sort of baked into their practices, their principles, this idea of sharing that wisdom. And sometimes it's very formalized. But in our space, I guarantee we've all had similar failures on projects and we're not really equipped or encouraged to have those open and honest conversations about, well, this is why our project failed. Now, I understand some of that is companies just don't like to admit that projects went south.
Right.
I think if you ask most C-level people, oh, no, every project's been a success. It's like Wobegon, right? All projects are above average. But we all know that we're probably running into similar things. And it would be so helpful to have those spaces to
Well,
honestly talk about that.
that's nice, both with the online content and then with the in-person. We'll have like 2, 3, 10-minute short presentations, followed by a half-hour facilitated table discussion, where
Hmm.
engineering leaders at larger companies are actually saying, well, you know what, I would do that, but then, we can't hire internationally because of, FedRAMP requirements. So they can actually get into the details of their use case and somebody can else agree, well,
Yeah,
I was a government contractor, here was the way we squared that circle, or here was the way we did it, or here was the thing we did.
sure.
And just to have that place, it's kind of lonely because, firstly, most CTOs used to be programmers. So
Right.
we kind of basically started off saying we prefer computers to humans.
Yeah.
And now suddenly we have hundreds of humans that we're supposed to influence
Uh-huh.
and lead and
Uh-huh.
engage with. So to create a space where we can all be honest and like the story, I'll usually open the summit by saying, hey, reason we're all here together is because I got fired in less than 6 months. Let's see if you can be a less shitty engineer and leader than I am. But it creates a space where we're not
Yeah.
killing it. We're not wearing suits. Like I stand up on stage, and the only way to get the engineering leaders to stop talking, they're so excited talking to each other, I squeak a Dave and Buster's rubber chicken.
Nice.
And it just is so, in some ways, we try to feel like the anti Gartner. We're with the
Okay.
cool kids, but we're admitting that none of us quite know how to do this, and we're all trying to make it
Right.
easier.
Right. Yeah, we're all learning from each other. So Fuel wants to know if there's a leads who geek.
That's the Rand Slack, which is
There you go.
awesome. I love like CTO Slackers, Rand Slack. There are all these resources. They can be a little heavy with tech leads and engineering managers. And fundamentally, the job changes when you move from EM to director as a
Yeah.
general rule of
Yeah.
thumb. You go from kind of, in the nicest possible way, doing what your boss says, filling out the checklist. You do the performance reviews, you run stand-ups, you do one-on-ones with your team, to being like, okay, we need you to go build a platform org, or we need you to go revamp how our interviewing process works across the company.
Right.
Those are more likely roles for a director, senior director. And to have a space where everyone is dealing with that level of complexity just really makes it a unique experience for the people who show
Right.
up.
And those things, a lot like architecture, pretty hard to Google, how to build a platform team, and I think that's part of what makes some of these challenges so fascinating. And again, also something we don't teach you in a computer science undergraduate degree. We don't teach you this in a boot camp. There's this whole host of things where, you just got to figure it out. And having that resource, to me, I think is really valuable, being able to bounce that stuff off other people who've been there, done that, and have some sense of even patterns, if you will, of how to do this.
Well, that's effectively what I get. At the moment, I'm interviewing 3 to 5 senior engineering leaders. I'm interviewing the SVP of engineering at Slack later today, and the CTO of SnapLogic, a low-code tool, both in one day. So I think steady state, I'm going to get to the point where I'm doing about 8 of these interviews a week.
Wow.
And I'm basically a vertically integrated podcast company that happens to run conferences. But the fun thing is that you absolutely start to see the patterns emerging. You know where the bodies are hidden. So when you said that, how did you have that conversation with the CFO when you started to talk about the pricing for Datadog right now, and what had happened if you 5x'd your volumes, right? It's like, so you had that challenge. So, from a diversity perspective, how did you manage that? Or how do you just see the same patterns time and time again. And it's not as simple, it's tough. I would love to build a playbook for this. And look, for 0 to 30, there's a playbook, which is mainly just get product market fit. Don't go out of business before you do it. For 30 to 100 engineers, there's a playbook. It's like, build an interview system, use bar raisers. There's all these systems you use and how you plug them in. And I think we will end up shipping or engaging with people who build those playbooks.
Yeah.
Once you get to larger orgs, they're all kind of dysfunctional in their own unique way.
Oh, sure.
And it's like, well, I'm telling you that, my question might be, should there be a CTO with a VP of product reporting to them, a CPO with a VP of engineering reporting to them, or two C-level executives? And the naive answer is, well, it depends whether you want the CEO to have to be dealing with all the brawls between product and engineering every time.
Right.
But the truth is, depends on the person. How technical is your CPO? How product or business focused is your CTO? And it kind of, within reason, doesn't matter. It's more the details of getting the right people in the right place in a way that also works for your culture.
Right.
I remember when I used to do trainings. Nominally, my job was to teach people. I taught Redis, Mongo, GitHub, all kinds of, at the time, new technologies 10, 12 years ago. But basically, my job was to figure out who the tribal chieftain was and to get them to buy in.
Yes.
There'd be 20 people around the table, and there was this one person, more often than not, a gentleman, often a little older, who was like, so I don't see why we would ever want to give up on Perforce, given everything that Perforce has done for us. And your job was actually to
That's how we've always done it.
That's how we've always done it here. What's wrong with VI, right? What's wrong with Vim or Emacs? And the job is actually to engage with the humans to figure out how they can get the outcomes they want to create the appropriate reward system so that you can, Fuel Snapple, we'll go there over a beer one night. I'm telling you. All I'm going to say is just add me to your team and just wait till I take a vacation and have all the files checked out.
Yep. 100%.
But you want to create an environment, and actually that's the hard part, and that's where you really need these informal discussions. It's very hard to create a playbook for taking an engineering team from 100 to 1,000.
Yeah, I agree, Sean. You have to Google how to exit. So that's the downside.
My favorite, I never knew how to use VI at all. I actually ended up giving a 45-minute presentation at Yao on basically cool things you can do with Git. And it was basically terminal only. I'm like, okay, let's go.
Let's go.
And the only reason I learned VI was because I looked really stupid when I was giving presentations and couldn't exit out of it.
Right. So I never figured that part out. So this kind of came up with Dan earlier when he asked about tools, but tell me about Dev Tool Heroes.
So it's kind of a passion project, honestly, which is it's because I don't have enough interviews. I want
No,
the
no,
only
you don't
way
have
I
enough
get
going on.
here's the deal. The only way people will actually speak to me is if I book them to like interview them. It's like,
That's
I
fair.
go to a bar,
That's
everyone
fair.
walks
Harsh but
away.
fair.
So yeah. So think about it for a moment. We all imagine a world without Kubernetes, without Mongo, um, without Launch Darkly, without all the things that JetBrains does. All of these things, we depend deeply on developer tools, and they absolutely help
Yeah.
us to have more impact level, raise the level of abstraction, and develop and reason about more complex systems. But think about it from one like if you're Edith Harbour or like if you founded Launch Darkly back in the day, why would you be like, yeah, I could get a job making $400,000 a year as a principal engineer at Netflix, but what I'm going to do is go into my savings, try to raise money, beg a bunch of VCs, and then persuade my friends to join me because I
Hmm.
care this much about observability, charity
Right.
majors, feature
Right.
flagging, Edith Harbour. And so what we're doing is we're going to do a series of interviews with some of the old guard, the honeycombs and the data dogs and the launch darklies, but also with the next generation, like a lot of the tooling now coming out for control planes, for Gen AI. And the human stories like, dude, you're a geek. You could like just get a job and make lots of money. Why did you choose to
Right.
do this? And then also it's a way to learn about the next generation of developer tooling to understand what's going to be on the horizon for you or your team. So DevTool Heroes is going to be weekly interviews starting in September with the technical founders of dev and data tool companies.
That's very cool because one of the things that I've touched on a lot in this series, especially when I've interviewed people very active in the open source community, is like, how'd you get into that? Because I think a lot of folks look at it and say, "Oh, I could never contribute. I'm not smart enough. I'm not a good enough engineer." And it's like, yeah, no, you totally could. I mean, I've even committed to open source, so it can't be that hard. And so I think it's really interesting to hear some of those stories and see how people got that idea and were so passionate about it. They said, yeah, I'm going to own that. And I mean, I think it's very cool. And I think that's a fascinating space. I'm excited to see what comes out of that, my friend.
Me too. Let's see how the interviews go.
They'll go fantastic. I know that. I know that. There's no getting around that. So let's see. Was there anything I missed in here? Okay. So, yeah, apparently the first lesson that Sean learned was how to exit. So he no longer feels how to exit. And yes, I agree with Fuel. Vim is good if you've got one shared machine. I worked for a Unix admin in college, and he, of course, was an expert in VI, and it was because he knew it was always going to be on any machine that he SSH'd into. So I'm like, yeah, I totally understand that. That makes perfect sense.
Well, for system stuff, you have to use it. But once it's funny because I always used to say, like, for statically typed languages and strongly typed languages, you'd be more likely to use an IDE because you've got more help. But these days, you look at
Mm,
tools even like Ruby, mine, I'm like, okay, yeah, that's better than VI.
yeah, yeah, I'm pretty hard pressed to not want to have those at my disposal. I mean, it's sort of like trying to write a paper without having how to autocorrect my poor spelling. God knows I don't know how to spell anymore. We talked about that in the pre-show. Like, no, that's not my expertise in any way, shape, or form. But
Well, again, we
oh,
should be delegating to computers the stuff they do better, right? Otherwise, they're just gonna.
absolutely,
It was I think Neil Ford used to say that otherwise the computers are just going to sit around laughing at us at night
pretty
because we're
much.
doing stuff we could have
Can you
automated.
believe they did this by hand? I could have done that in 30 milliseconds. It would have been over. Yeah, no, it's pretty ridiculous how dependent we get on some of those things for sure. Oh, okay. So Fuel says that Vim supports
Oh,
LSP. Okay, all right. Well, maybe I should try that if you'll pry my ID out of my cold dead hands until generative AI comes along and I can just
well,
say computer.
it's crazy. I like. I know that there's this natural progression if you don't stay as, a principal or distinguished engineer, like if you don't stay on the engineering track, that you kind of get further away from technology.
Yeah.
And language and process was it that or protocol? That's something I'm not familiar with. But I think I only really started feeling old. I mean, I'm not young, I'm 53, but I really started feeling old. So there's this wonderful guy, Jean Sini, who was an operator. He was like a director of engineering. He had some exits, and now he runs a Regular Expressions, which is a VC specifically focused on dev and data tool companies. Kind of like Heavy Bit for the East Coast.
Okay.
And the weird thing was they did this thing. There is now, you have influencer houses on the West Coast where, the TikTok and Insta
Right.
stars like hang out together. Well, now there is a geek influencer house, like an AI influencer
Really?
house in the Bay Area. And I spoke to 3 or 4 of the kids, and they were like, "Oh yeah, the paper
It's
you're referencing was from. I mean, like they were probably like 19 to 24,
right.
and they were like, "Oh yeah, but the paper you're referencing that's from last week, and it doesn't take into account the work that's being done here. If you saw the Polish
Right.
paper, you would see that fundamentally the reinforcement, using the multi models to do the reinforcement so that you can remove the human from the loop in the trading is obviously the way we're going to optimize this." And I'm like.
Okay.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe like the Gen AI, like I feel like I will be able to come to terms with it from a business perspective and engagement. I don't know, I taught some data science at Columbia. To be fair, it was at Columbia Business School, so it was like just enough data science for MBAs. So that's not quite
Right.
the same as
Right.
teaching like a class in the computer science department. But I'm like, man, I just the pace of innovation.
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
think I'm going to be able to keep up with it.
No, no. I mean, I think that's one of those things you just come to grips with, and you realize that you just cannot keep up with everything. You've got to let your passion dictate. Certainly, the older I get, the more interested I am in the more evergreen kind of skills, and I'm constantly recommending that people read How to Win Friends and Influence People. Those soft skill
Dale
things that we
Carnegie.
all try to ignore when we're younger, and it's like, yeah, no, you're gonna definitely need to understand that stuff. And yeah, I mean, so it's even like things like crypto or all these things. I mean, having a teenager, you start to hear some of these things, and you're like, "What? What? What did you just say?" He said something the other day to me, and I looked at him. And I said, "What does that mean?" And he said, "That means to leave." I'm like, "Since when?" "Oh, like since forever." I'm like, "Nope, nope. That's your generation just made that crap up, And it's like, but it's in this song. Like, well, that's great, but you still just made it up, and that's fine. And then he realized that's the natural circle of life, right? I learned music from my kid because he'll be playing something like, oh, that's kind of cool, or he'll be like, I think you'd like this, and so that's how I get introduced to new things is by having him, be my filter. But
What can I say? Get the hell off my lawn.
exactly, exactly, exactly. Well, with that, my friend, I will just say I'll be out in Las Vegas next week for Spring One. I got to
Nice.
pump that, and I'm delighted to see that Sherrod's going to be out there too. So I think that's going to be fun. I'm hoping the temperatures stay on the right side of like 40 C. So you understand that. I don't. I just know that it's bloody hot out there, but. We'll see what kind of trouble that gets me in. Yeah, here we go. Yeah, my lawn is my sacred space. And get off my digital lawn 100%. Gentlemen of a certain age, I'll appreciate the kids these days. But my friend, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. I'm super excited to see what comes out of DevTool Heroes. And I've certainly I mean, I've known you a long time, and I had no idea some of the things you said today. So this has been a joy for me to get to know you a little better, and I hope that extends to our audience here. Yes, the damn youth and the hair. Yes, exactly. You're correct, Fuel. We're all clearly in a similar age range, shall we say? There's a little bit of the gray showing up in the goatee and slightly more forehead than we used to have. Oh, good times,
Nate,
good times.
Nate, thank you so much for the invitation. It's been awesome to catch up, and I've really enjoyed meeting some of the listeners as well, some of the
Awesome.
community.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, my friend.